All right, so we're very pumped up, obviously, from the Panthers' performance last night. 3-2 lead. They will look to close things out tomorrow night right here in Sunrise. Joining us now, the voice of the NHL on ESPN, ABC, Sean McDonough here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sean. Before we get to the Panthers and what took place in Toronto last night, I'm fascinated by, the schedule that guys like yourself keep. Like, what is a week in Sean McDonough's play-by-play life this time of year when you're all over the country from this playoff game to this playoff game? What's this past week like for you?
Yeah, well, it's been pretty busy, ever since the playoffs started, and some of it is the unknown. I mean, as you and I are speaking right now, I flew back to Boston from Toronto this morning, and now we're waiting to find out where we go next, because if Carolina and Washington go to a game 6, we would have that on Saturday. But if that series ends tonight, then we don't. And then we would wait to find out what our next assignment is, probably the start of one of the conference finals. And we don't know which one of those we're doing, because it depends on the matchups and the dates and that sort of thing. So a lot of it, I could be on a plane to Raleigh tomorrow morning. I might be here in Boston all weekend. So, but it's fun. But it's just been a lot of traveling. A couple of weeks ago, I was texting with a friend of mine, and I said, this was the 10th day in the last 14 that I've been on an airplane. So, it's and right now it's 4 out of 5. Today was the 4th time in the last 5 days that I was on a plane. So a lot of traveling, but it's fun, obviously.
And so at this point, we're late in the second round, and like you said, Eastern Conference Finals. We only got 4 teams remaining right now in the East. So, are you locked in on these 4 teams at this point? Panthers, Leafs, Capitals, Hurricanes. Do you know everything you need to know about all 4 of these teams at this point?
I think so. We've had them all a bunch this season. We've done games now in both of these series. Obviously, we had the Florida-Toronto game last night. We did the first couple of games in the Carolina-Washington series in Washington. We had a bunch of Washington games in the first round against Montreal. It's possible our group could do the Western Conference Final. So I'm also, focusing. We had Dallas in that memorable Game 7 against Colorado at the first round. So we've had them. We haven't had Edmonton this year, at least I haven't. But obviously we had them in the Stanley Cup Final last year. And the nucleus, it's largely the same team. They've kind of changed the roster a little bit around the edges. But so no matter who it is, we'll be ready to go. And the thing about this, Jonathan, is, in hockey, there isn't a ton of time for storytelling. If you do try to weave something in during the action, it has to be, a little nugget, one sentence, and just kind of get it in quickly. And especially in these games, I mean, the game is the most important thing. Every puck battle in the corner, every block shot, every penalty, what's happening on the ice is just so important that, most of our call is just describing what's going on and reacting to it.
Sean, I want you to tell me what that building was like last night being there. At what point, was it 1-0? Was it 3-0? At what point were you able to just feel like the air was completely sucked out the building?
Probably 3-0 cemented it. I think the awful turnover that Mitch Marner committed, kind of added to the angst and the aggravation of the fans. It was so electric at the start, and, inside and outside the building, we basically have to walk right through that Maple Leaf Square, or at least by it, to get into the building. And, when we were arriving 2 hours before the game, they were already out there having a really good time and getting ready for the game. So it was electric, but it turned ugly. I mean, it was not just a smattering of boos. There were a couple times the boos were quite loud. At the end of the game, a couple people threw Maple Leaf jerseys out onto the ice as if they were throwing in the towel on their team. Obviously, with this group, there's 9 straight years now in the playoffs of frustration. And, I think they thought the way this series, they being Leafs Nation, thought the way this series started, and, you're a Panther guy, it was 2-0. Toronto goes down there. They score in the first minute of the game. They twice had a 2-goal lead. They led 3-1. I'm thinking, as watching this, oh my God, this might be a sweep. I mean, they are totally outplaying them. Everything is going Toronto's way. Florida can't find its game that, is what got them to the Stanley Cup final the last 2 years and what got them into the position they're in this year. They just couldn't get in on the forecheck and cause turnovers and play good defense in front of Bobrovsky, and he wasn't very good either, obviously. So, I mean, everything was going Toronto's way, and then it turned. And I think with Toronto, especially their fans, once it turns toward the negative, it becomes, oh my gosh, here we go again. Here comes another Toronto playoff disappointment, failure. And, that's what it's looking like. Because after last night, it's really, really hard to imagine that Toronto is going to right itself, win a game 6 on the road, go home and win a game 7 with as bad as that was last night and the way it's gone the last 3 games.
That's the part that I'm thinking about. Like today, probably right now, when Toronto is boarding the plane to come to Sunrise for the game tomorrow night. I mean, how are they not thinking, wow, we're getting on a plane for them to just kick our ass tomorrow night? That's the way the series feels,
It did last night. I mean, that was really total domination. And it was kind of similar to the previous game in that if Joseph Woll didn't make several excellent saves, that could have been worse at the start of the game for Toronto. They actually hung in there for a while because the goaltending was good, because Florida was right all over them from the start again in game 5 last night. So, yeah, I don't know how they do it. And, there just aren't any good signs. I mean, we talked about it several times, including in the open of the telecast last night. They need Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, particularly Austin Matthews, to do something. And I think he must be hurt. There's been a lot of talk for a lot of the year that there's something wrong, upper body wrong with him. And I'd have to think that that's true, because he just really hasn't been, the Austin Matthews that we've seen in the past. And he went from 69 goals last season to 33 this year. And you barely even notice him now when he's on the ice, and Mitch Marner, the same thing. We mentioned going to the third period last night. At that point, he had 2 shots on goal in 84 minutes of ice time that he had been out there for. I mean, it's a game and a half, and and it was over a span of 4 games, but he basically in 84 minutes played the equivalent of a game and a half, and had 2 shots on goal. So if your best players aren't a factor at all, you have no chance. And they have not been much of a factor.
Give me your thoughts here, Sean, on the job that Paul Maurice has done this series. It just seems like he's pushing all the right buttons. And what I mean in that sense is, he inserts AJ Greer onto that 4th line a couple games ago. He scores a goal last night. Carter Verhaeghe was kind of struggling, slow start in the playoffs, moves him from the 1st line to the 2nd line, and now he's unlocked him alongside Bennett and Tkachuk. And even last night, where Jesper Boquist is in place of Evan Rodriguez, puts him right on that top line in place of Rodriguez, and Boquist scores the 2nd goal of the game. I mean, it feels like he's just pushing all the right buttons right now.
Yeah, I think he is. And, I thought that all new 4th line coming into the series in the 3rd game, as we said, didn't go well at all in Toronto. They need to change something. They put out this kind of big, heavy 4th line, and they were immediately impactful. And as you said, they were again last night. And, to put Boquist up there, we talked to Paul 2 hours before the game, and I asked him we talked to him in the morning at the morning skate yesterday. And I asked him, how's Rodriguez doing? He said, well, he's not going to play tonight. And he said, Boquist will go in and he'll just slot in, on the top line. And I thought, that's odd. But Paul's explanation makes sense. Those other lines are doing really well, as you just said, particularly the 3rd line with Marchand and his bunch. But that 2nd line is obviously a terrific 2nd line. So I don't think you want to mess up everybody. Okay, you change everybody, you slot people up and down, and now all the combinations are different, and maybe you caused a problem. So, it was excellent coaching. He's a great coach. That Boquist had played with those other 2 guys for a total of 1 minute and 28 seconds the whole season.
Right.
And that was by accident. It was probably he's out for a shift and got stuck out there. He came on while they were stuck out there, and they were out there for a little bit a couple times. So, and I think the other thing that helps him, and he said this when we had games early in the 1st round against Tampa Bay, he said going into the playoffs, we have 17 forwards who can play and not hurt us in the playoffs. They had to sit out 5 guys who might otherwise be playing for a lot of these other teams. And so when things get a little stagnant or you have an injury, you can go to that depth and not really have any drop off. And we've seen that in this series. They've had 17 different people score a goal for them.
Yep.
In 10 games. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, that number went from 13 to 17 last night. So I think Bill Zito, obviously, and his group deserve a lot of credit too, because they've built a team with a lot of depth and talent, which is really hard to do, especially in a salary cap era.
Sean, you're a New England area guy. Your family, obviously, longtime New England area. Brad Marchand in a Panther jersey. Like, how weird is that?
Yeah, it's weird. I'm happy for him. He obviously seems to be enjoying it. And, to have the chance at this stage in his career at 37 to jump onto one of the best teams in the league, maybe the best team in the league, have a chance to win another Stanley Cup late in his career. And it's, again, we just talked about it with Bill Zito. They just have a knack, not just for making trades to make their team better at the deadline, but they bring in the right people more often than not. And, when they made this trade, I thought, well, Marchand's hurt. He's not going to be able to play for a little bit. When he did start playing, he kind of eased his way back into it. Wasn't very good. And then you kind of saw I think he had two goals in the last 4 regular season games, started to find his stride a little bit. And then he's been his usual self in the playoffs, particularly in this series. And, he's the worst nightmare. We talk about the angst of the Toronto Maple Leaf fans. He's particularly done it too. That we had the graphic last night. The only 2 players in the history of playoff games against Toronto, which is 107 years of Maple Leafs history, who had more points in playoff games against Toronto are Gordie Howe and Alex Delvecchio, who are legendary players. And that was, I'm sure most, if not all of that was done back in the 16, when you played them all the time.
Right.
Now Marchand's played them a lot. I think it's 4 series against Toronto prior to this one when he was with Boston. And Boston won all 4. But he's been tremendous. He still has his game. If he's dropped off, it's just a little bit. And he's been a big factor. I think in this series, he's been as important as anybody, because certainly that overtime goal he scored in Game 3 is the biggest goal in this series. If that game goes the other way and Toronto wins in overtime and they're up 3-0, we're not having this conversation that we've been having.
Panthers look to close it out tomorrow night. Like you heard, Sean, we don't know when we're going to see him again. We will see him again soon, though. Depends on the outcome of some of these games. Great job, Sean. I really appreciate you joining the show today. Thank you so much.
Always my pleasure, Jonathan. Thanks. And always fun to be down there. I hope we get back to Sunrise. The fans down there are great. For the Stanley Cup final last year, ESPN, with the cooperation of the league and the Panthers, and I really appreciate everybody doing that, built us a low booth. That arena, as there, you're extremely high and far from. And so we had a booth that was basically on a still photographer platform down right in the stands, probably 20 rows off the ice. So not only is it a great vantage point because you can see everything, but you also really feed off the energy. You get a real sense of the energy of the crowd. But the people there are so nice. I've almost sort of gotten to know the people who are around us because we literally are right there in the stands. So I love going there, and I hope we get back there.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, my friend. Thanks.